Hello and welcome. So today I just wanted to go over resistances and kind of explain in the most simple and straight to the point kind of way everything you need to know about the basics of resistances. Things such as how much resistances do you need, when do you need them, why you need them, and the differences between the various resistance levels. And that'll kind of open it up so you can make an educated decision for yourself on what resistances you actually need for the content that you plan on tanking. So resistances are also known as armor sometimes, and they are an additional layer of protection that helps to reduce some of the incoming damage you receive. There are two types of resistances. You've got physical resistance and you've got spell resistance. These can also break off into separate resistances for different types of damage, such as fire, shock, ice, magic, poison, disease, and bleed damage. Resistances have a cap in PvE content of 33,000. So if you have resistances higher than 33,000, they're not doing anything, and it's a complete waste. So always aim for a maximum of 33k resistances or less. That's when you are fully buffed. So when you take into account all of your different armor buffs, when fully buffed, if you're over 33k, then consider adjusting things to reduce them down so that you're not wasting stats on something that's not doing anything. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about how the different elemental resistances work. So if we take an example, if you had 33k spell resistance and 5k fire resistance, the fire resistance wouldn't do anything because fire resistance is tied into spell resistance already. And because you're already at the spell resistance cap, that 5k fire resistance wouldn't do anything. If you had 25k spell resistance and 5k fire resistance, this basically means that you have 25k spell resistance against all spell damage types, but you've got 30k resistance against fire attacks specifically. So if you are focusing on different elemental resistances, just consider the fact that they are tied in to the physical or the spell, depending on which one it is. Obviously, the spell resistance ties in with fire, frost, shock, and magic, and your physical damage ties in with disease, bleed, and poison. When you have 33,000 resistances, this will provide you with a maximum of the 50% mitigation. This works out at around 660 resistance for 1% mitigation. So if we take a look at our block mitigation, if you have 75% block mitigation and 33k resistances, the way this works is you obviously can't reduce your damage incoming by 75% from your block mitigation and 50% from your resistances. There is a cap on block mitigation of 90%. So you can go above 90% block mitigation, but it won't do anything past 90%. The way you combine resistances with block mitigation in terms of working out how much damage you're going to take. So as you can see here, I've got 75% block mitigation. This means that I'm going to reduce incoming damage by 75%. So when I take damage, it's going to be 75% less while I'm blocking. So now I'm only going to take 25% of the total damage. If I was to also have 33k resistances, this equals 50% mitigation. So I would now take 50% less damage of the 25% left over. So the 25% damage I'm still taking after my block mitigation is going to be mitigated by my resistances. So now I'm only going to take 12.5% damage while blocking with 75% block mitigation and 33k resistances. Resistances are important for tanking, but it's not essential to hit the 33k resistance cap. Often, if you try to build up your resistances to the cap, you'll lose max stats, sustain, or create other potential issues in other areas of your build. My overall suggested resistances for tanking are always somewhere between 28 and 30k, fully buffed as a main tank, and the more experienced you are, the less resistances you'll likely need, because you'll be able to avoid more damage, and so your resistances will have less of an impact when you're able to not take as much damage. Sometimes having high resistances can be valuable. So this includes things such as the Kain's Aegis last boss hard mode. That boss hits very quickly, it hits high amounts of damage, and the fight is a long duration. So the higher resistances you have in that situation, you're going to reduce a huge amount of damage because it's such a long fight with such high damage. So it is worth it over the course of a long fight like that. Other places where resistances are useful, something such as Cloud Rest. So in the portal especially, you have multiple sources of incoming damage inside the portal and no healer. So by having high resistances, you take less damage, which means you need to heal less, which means you can sustain for longer. And high resistances are also really good whenever you're doing any high-end, risky kind of boss burn strategies in trials, and in some really hard-hitting dungeon content DLC hard modes as well. So just to kind of show you the difference between various resistances, I'm going to show up a table on the screen now. This is 25k resistances to 30k resistances. So each 1,000 resistance. So with this table, we're making it easy by showing what sort of damage it would take if we say the initial damage from a boss, the hit would have been 100k if you weren't blocking or had any resistances. And then we take into consideration that we've got 75% block mitigation, and we're assuming we're blocking, and we've shown the damage on the table here that you would be taking with each amount of resistances. And then we've compared the incoming damage compared to what you would have been hit for at maximum 33k resistances. So if we had 33k resistances, we had 50% block mitigation, we get hit for 100k, but then we've mitigated it with those two things. The actual damage would be 12,500. If we then look at 32k resistance, that's only 48.5% mitigation. These numbers are rounded to one decimal place. 32k resistance, 48.5% mitigation, and 75% block mitigation. With a 100k hit, we'd get hit for 375 more damage compared to the 33k resistances. At 31k resistance, we'd be hit for 750 more damage. 30k resistance would be 1,125 more damage. All the way up to 25k, where we'd get hit for 3,025 more damage. So, realistically speaking, 3,025 more damage isn't really that much, considering there's other sources of things that would impact that more. And the incoming damage difference between sort of 33k and 30k is an extra 1,000 incoming damage, which would be quite unnoticeable. So this is why I always suggest like 28 to 30k resistances is fine, because trying to build to 33k does require you to actually kind of build for it in most situations by either running the Lady Mundus, maybe running Lord Warden monster set, potentially running reinforced pieces, and it's just not necessary because those extra incoming pieces of damage, those can be reduced further already by things such as major and minor Aegis, major and minor Maim, minor protection, and things like that. Those damage numbers are without even considering the extra things that we can do to reduce damage. And obviously, we've usually got minor Aegis with our gear, like such as Yolnacrin. We've usually got minor Maim from Heroic Slash. So that number, you wouldn't actually get hit for that much more, because it would potentially be even less when you take those other things into consideration as well. So just to kind of recap, guys, as you can see, the difference between 25k resistances and 33k resistances, the damage difference from a 100k hit with 75% block mitigation would be about 3,000 damage extra at 25k resistance. So it's actually not a huge amount, and that amount would be mitigated further and reduced further by other sources of different buffs and debuffs that we might have. So I just wanted to kind of point out that the fact you don't need to have 33k resistances. The amount that your resistance affects damage is very, very small in comparison to blocking. And your resistances reduce a very, very tiny amount at the end, and it's not as important as some people seem to think. Not having capped out resistances is definitely not essential. So if you were at 32k resistance, the difference between, you wouldn't even notice the difference from 32 to 33k. You probably wouldn't notice the difference from 30 to 33k either. So just take that into consideration when you're setting up. Also take into consideration the content you're doing, whether it's really hard hitting. If you've got an enemy that hits fast, it hits hard, and it hits for a long duration of time because it's a long fight, then yeah, definitely consider taking those resistances a bit higher. If you are in base game, easier content, you definitely don't need to build your resistances. You don't need any resistances really for doing veteran dungeons. You might consider them a bit more for DLC vet dungeons, and then for things like normal content, normal trials, resistances, you can tank that sort of content without any CP or resistances. Just your gear would get you through that sort of content. So don't worry about it as much for that sort of thing. For vet DLC hard mode trials, it starts to become a little bit more important, but still, once again, 28 to 30k is usually perfectly fine. When you're in combat and fully buffed, you're generally at that without building into it anyway. So I hope this information has kind of helped you understand resistances a bit better. If you've got any questions, don't forget to drop a comment below, and you can also ask us in the Tank Club Discord. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye for now.